Welcome to Learn Extra Matric History Revision. Today we'll be looking at the theme, the end of the Cold War and the New World Order. But for source analysis, I'd like us to look at the New World Order, and then later on we're going to look at an essay which will be looking at the end of the Cold War or the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, before we analyze our sources and look at the type of questions you're likely to get in your exam, let's quickly look at our checklist. You need to make sure that you revise the relevant content and context for this topic. That is very important because you'll find that with each and every theme in history, you will be expected to know the concepts around that theme and the content and context. It's very, very important that you know all that. You need to be able to define the different concepts that are found around the theme. You need to know cause and effect. You need to know the background to that particular event. And obviously, you need to understand the entire topic. Those things are very important. Another thing is you need to know how to analyze the different types of sources. What will happen in an exam situation is that you will get different types of sources. Sometimes you'll get written sources. They can be different perspectives, okay? And then sometimes you'll get a cartoon, which is a visual source, and you can also get a visual source in the form of a photograph. All those sources are analyzed in different ways, and the types of questions that get asked in the exam are different depending on the type of source that the examiner has used in that particular theme or question. So it's very important for you to know how to analyze the different types of sources. And then another very important thing is to be able to construct a coherent argument for the extended writing question. That means for both the paragraph and the essay question. Now, before we look at the questions, I'd like us to look at the sources. We're going to read the source together, and then we're going to analyze the source to obviously extract the relevant information, okay, and then we're going to answer the questions together. Now remember, it's very important to analyze your sources properly before you can answer the questions. And then we'll take a break and then look at a different type of source, and then later on we'll look at an essay question as promised. Now let's start with source 1A. Again, it's very important to read your caption. The caption tells you, I'm going to underline so that you can see what I'm talking about. This source focuses on the results. Okay, that is very important. Results of globalization for both the rich and poor nations. So when we're reading the source, the entire source, this is a written source, that is what we should be looking for. We should be extracting that information or those points that are telling us what the results were of globalization for both the rich and the poor nations. Now let's read the source together. Globalization has resulted in increased international trade. Okay, so that could be a positive thing or a negative thing depending on how you view globalization. So there is increased international trade, a company operating in more than one country. Okay, I'm going to write here the multinational corporations because we'll see these later on. The multinational corporations, we know those. Greater dependence on the global economy. So in other words, the countries are interdependent. It's not possible for any one country to stand on its own. There is also a freer movement of capital. That means the money that is used to start up businesses can move freely between countries. There is also free movement of goods. So it's not just the money, but it's the products and services. That means the skills, okay, between the different nations. That is what globalization has done. Recognition of companies such as McDonald's and Starbucks in less economically developed countries, the LEDC. So in other words, those multinational corporations, remember I wrote that word earlier on, are found or they're from the rich countries. However, because of globalization, they are able to open up outlets in the poorer countries, which means that the people in poorer countries are able to benefit from these multinational corporations, but on the other hand, these multinational corporations cause problems as well. Because remember, the caption did say that we are going to look at the results of globalization for both these countries. So we need to look at how the rich countries have benefited and how the poor countries have benefited, but in some cases have not benefited from globalization. Because we know that there are instances where these multinational corporations exploit these poor countries. And then if you read on the source, it says, although globalization is probably helping to create more wealth. So that's another thing that we need to look at, that globalization helps to create more wealth. So that's another positive thing about globalization. So it creates more wealth in developing countries. It is not helping to close the gap between the world's poorest countries and the world's richest. So you have the positive here, I'll just write P, and then you have the negative, I'll write N for the negative there. So they're looking at both the positive and the negative effects of globalization. Because remember, as I told you that we're looking at the results of globalization. Globalization has resulted in many businesses setting up or buying operations in other countries. Companies that operate in several countries are called multinational corporations, the MNCs, or transnational corporations, the TNCs. Now remember, I did allude to that earlier on. The US fast food chain McDonald's is a large multinational corporation. So this is just an example of a multinational corporation. It's not the only one, but they've given you an example of a multinational corporation. And the reason why they've given you that example is because it's the one that is obviously recognizable. Everyone knows what McDonald's is. It has nearly 30,000 restaurants in 119 countries. That is why it is so recognizable, obviously, after Coca-Cola. And then if we read on, it says globalization operates mostly in the interests of the richest countries. So that is the criticism of globalization, that it operates mostly in the interests of the richest countries. Remember earlier on I told you that sometimes it leads to exploitation of the poorer countries, which continue to dominate. So these rich countries dominate world trade at the expense of developing countries. The role of the less economically developed countries in the world market is mostly to provide the North and West with cheap labor. So that is how globalization is affected the poorer countries, that the only thing they provide is cheap labor, and they also provide the raw materials. So in other words, this talks to exploitation I told you about earlier on, that these rich Western and often European countries exploit these developing countries that were previously known as third world countries. Remember, we don't use those terms anymore, first and third world. We look at countries as, or refer to them as, developed and developing. There are no guarantees that the wealth from inward investment will benefit the local community. So in other words, what this source is saying is that these multinational corporations that originate from the rich countries, what happens is that they take the money they make from the poorer countries, they take it back to the rich countries. That this money is not invested back in the poorer countries to help develop them. That is the reason why earlier on the source says that globalization has not closed the gap between the rich and the poor countries. Instead, those people who are against globalization argue that the gap is actually widening. that the rich countries are becoming richer at the expense of the poor countries, while the poor countries are becoming poorer because they are being exploited. As I said to you, they are the sources of cheap labor and raw materials, but they are not benefiting the same way as the rich countries. Now let's read on. Often profits are sent back to the more economically developed country where the TNC is based. So that is the point I was making earlier on, that is where they originate from, and they go to the poorer countries, they open up businesses or outlets there or branches, and then they take the money back to those countries instead of investing the money in the less developed countries. Transnational companies may drive local companies out of business. I'm going to underline that. That's a very important point as well, because that is another negative effect of globalization, that these big companies from rich countries may drive local companies out of business, partly because these companies from the poorer countries are not able to compete with the rich countries. If it becomes cheaper to operate in another country, the TNC might close down the factory and make local people redundant. That is another problem, that globalization has also led to unemployment, because there are always, these multinational corporations or the transnational corporations are always looking for opportunities that are going to maximize their income. If they are in a country where they are not gaining any profits, then they are not likely to stay in that country. They are going to move elsewhere. They're going to look for opportunities that are going to yield them more profits. So if that happens and their company has to close down, then the people in those poorer countries who were employed by that TNC or MNC, the multinational corporation, or the transnational corporation, will then lose their jobs. So they will be unemployed, and that will create poverty for those people. That is what we refer to as the new poverty. Now you will know that when you look at globalization, we say that it creates new wealth and new poverty. So the people who would have been employed before, they will find themselves unemployed if the TNC or the MNC moves to another country, and that creates new poverty. So that is the result of globalization. And then if we read on, an absence of strictly enforced international laws means that TNCs may operate in less economically developed countries in a way that would not be allowed in a more economically developed country. So that is the exploitation. In other words, these TNCs take advantage of these less economically developed countries because there are no international laws of, telling them or instructing them how they should run their businesses. They may pollute, that is very important, I'm going to underline that they lead to pollution because they obviously disregard the laws of that country. The environment, run risks with safety, that is also very important, or impose poor working conditions. Most of them don't even look at the working hours, they don't look at the working conditions, they don't look at the minimum wage as set out by the different developing countries, because obviously the people in those countries, the poorer countries, are so desperate for investment, they're so desperate for jobs that they would allow these countries, these companies to come into their country. But then the problem is that these multinational corporations then disregard the laws of the country and they don't pay the workers a minimum wage. So that's another thing that they look at, that they also pay very low wages on local workers. So those are the results of globalization. So as you have seen from this source, the source has given us the results for the rich countries, how they benefit, and how the poorer countries don't benefit from globalization. Now let's look at the questions you're likely to get based on the source we've just analyzed. Question 1.1, we've already read source 1A. Define the concept globalization in your own words. Again, I'm going to analyze own words. That's very important because even though the definition is there in the source, you expect it to show your understanding of this concept. And again, you remember when we were looking at our checklist, I told you that it's very important to understand or learn the concepts and context of a particular theme that you're studying for the exam. Now let's look at the likely response that you can come up with from this. It is a global network of economic communication and trade which has monopolized the global village. So it's any other relevant answer that is also acceptable. So you can say that it refers to the interdependence of the world in terms of the global economy, or it refers to the shrinking of the world and the coming together of the world that is obviously driven by world trade. As long as you show understanding, as long as you understand what globalization is about and you bring in that global village effect, then that will be the correct answer and you get 2 marks for that. And then the next question is, what, according to the source, again I'm going to underline that because it's very important, it's not according to you or according to your own knowledge, but it's according to the source. What are 2 positive results of globalization? Now you will remember when we were analyzing the source, I told you that we were looking at the results for both the rich countries and the poor countries. So in this case, you're asked to only look at the positive results. So please read your question carefully, and when you're asked to give the positive results, don't give the negative results. Now let's look at the likely responses. There is increased international trade, that is the interdependence of countries we looked at earlier on. A company can operate in more than one country. That is a good thing because it means that a company will then be able to make money and invest in a country, and the people in the poorer country will be able to get employment. There is greater dependence on the global economy. There is also free movement of capital, goods and services. In other words, when people have got skills, it doesn't mean that those skills will be concentrated in one area, that we are able to share the skills as a country. So if something is invented in one country, it's not going to just stay there, but we are all going to benefit from it because of this interdependence that has been created by globalization. The recognition of companies such as McDonald's and Starbucks, those are the multinational corporations. So those are the positive effects of positive results of globalization. And then the next question is, in what ways do you think businesses like McDonald's and Starbucks could, A, assist less economically developed countries? So how could they help less economically developed countries? Now, I've already given you an answer or part of the answer to that question, how these less economically developed countries could benefit from the big multinational corporations like McDonald's and Starbucks. They could provide work in less economically developed countries. Cheaper products because they are able to produce more and to obviously advertise their products. Provide income for local communities that ties in with providing employment. Access new products. Remember earlier on I said to you, if something is invented in one country, it doesn't stay in that country, but it is shared throughout the world because of this global village effect. Access new technology. You will know that things like the iPhone, the iPad and all those things were not invented in South Africa. But how are we benefiting from those things? It's because of globalization, because these multinational corporations are able to sell to us or open outlets in South Africa as well, so that we as South Africans are able to benefit from them. So that is how you access new technology. There is also investment in less economically developed countries. So that is how these big multinational corporations are able to assist countries. And if you look at this answer, it says any other relevant answer. So you look at any way that the less economically developed country could benefit. And then B, you are now looking at the negative thing. So in A, we're looking at the positive impact of these multinational corporations, and they gave you examples. Remember, McDonald's and Starbucks are just examples. They're not saying that they are the only multinational corporations, but they just gave them to you as examples. Okay, so you can think of any multinational corporation. So in A, you were looking at the positive impact those big companies have on the less economically developed countries. And now in B, you are looking at the negative impact, because the question says exploit, I'm going to quickly underline that, exploit the less economically developed countries. So again, you're showing your understanding of the source and the understanding of this theme. Fast food, not a healthy option, because that is what they are about. They sell fast food. Exploitation of natural resources in less economically developed countries. Remember, we looked at how they can disregard the laws of that developing country. They can exploit the labor as well. Remember earlier on, we looked at the fact that they don't look at the working conditions because things are not regulated, and the minimum wage. So that is how they can exploit the workers there. They can also pollute the environment, and then any other relevant answer, as long as you show how these big multinational corporations can exploit the less economically developed countries. Question 4. Explain whether McDonald's can be used as an example of how typical businesses operated in the global economy. So in other words, you've given just one example, McDonald's. Now, is that an example of how these big companies operate in the global economy? So again, let's look at a possible answer there. Yes, McDonald's is a multinational company. We've already looked at that fact, and it shows its economic power and control. And then if you look at the source, the source tells you that McDonald's has 30,000 restaurants in about 119 countries. This shows that it is dominant. It shows its domination, and any other relevant response. So McDonald's is a multinational corporation, and it's typical of how businesses operate in the global economy. And then the last question based on this source is, what, according to the source, again, this is according to the source, is the roles of the less economically developed countries in a globalized economy? So in other words, how do these countries, the poorer countries, contribute to the globalized economy? So you only need 1 point there. Now let's look at the possible response you can come up with. They provide cheap labor. That might not be a good thing, as we said before, that it leads to exploitation. However, it is a good thing for the multinational corporation, because it means that they are able to invest or operate in a less developed country at minimum costs. They also provide raw materials, which means that these big multinational corporations can get these materials that they're going to send to their factories and turn them into manufactured goods, and then any other relevant answer. So those are the types of questions you're likely to get from that. We are now going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to look at a different type of source, which is a cartoon, still on A New World Order. I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. Now remember, before the break, we looked at a written source on globalization, a new world order. Now let's look at a different type of source, which is a cartoon, and we're going to analyze the cartoon together and then look at the type of questions you're likely to get. Okay, the cartoon portrays how multinational companies in the United States of America, I'm going to quickly underline that because it's giving you a specific place that it's there. So it shows how multinational companies in the United States of America did business in the globalized world. Now let's see if the cartoon does show that. Now remember, when you're analyzing a cartoon, it's very different from analyzing a photograph. Remember that in a cartoon, every little thing is there for a reason. So it's very important to look for clues to specific things, because all those things are there to convey a specific message. The cartoonist has decided to put those things there to obviously convey a specific message. Now let's look at this cartoon. You can see the different ships there and how the the United States did businesses in different countries. I'm quickly going to circle them so you can see there. Profits to Bermuda and jobs to India, factories to China. Okay, you also have Globomart Corporation, and then you've got people saying, and you call yourselves Americans. So in other words, they're mocking the Americans, saying, how can you call yourselves Americans when you've exported all these things to different countries? And then you've got John Kerry leaving for Canada. So he's leaving America. It does say Kerry here. And if you can't see that, you'll see at the bottom of that cartoon. Let me quickly show that to you. It does say Kerry. He's leaving the United States, going to another developed country. So that is how the United States did businesses with different parts of the world. Now let's look at the question. This is a very straightforward cartoon. It doesn't have a lot that you need to analyze. Everything is there and it's clear. Now let's look at the questions. We've studied 1B. The first question is, name the 2 countries that did business with the United States as depicted in the source. It's not according to your own knowledge. It's not according to you. It is as depicted in the source. So you just give those 2 countries. And then if you look at the possible responses there, it's China, India, and Bermuda. Okay, now you remember when we analyzed the source, I did circle those places. Remember the ships that were going there? Those are the 3 countries that the United States did business with. And then the next question, explain the messages that are conveyed in the cartoon. Use the visual clues. Okay, I'm going to quickly underline that. That is very important. Use the visual clues in the source to support your answer. Okay, so there are 2 parts to this. You're explaining the messages that are conveyed in the cartoon. So what is the cartoon trying to tell you? And then you use the visual clues to support your answer. So again, this question is testing your own understanding or your own analysis of the cartoon. Devastated as they could be without a job in the near future because the factories are going to China. That means the American people are devastated. Okay, they're also devastated by the fact that the economic activities were outsourced, jobs to India. So in other words, nothing is staying in the United States. There is resentment against the capitalist bosses for not investing profits in the developed countries. That is the message. That is why that guy said, and you call yourselves American, because he's saying there's nothing American about you if you're taking everything out of the country. You're going to different parts of the world. There's also resentment towards Kerry for leaving America for Canada. Now remember that car that I circled as well, that is labeled Kerry. John Kerry leaving America for Canada as he became one of the richest politicians that benefited from a globalized economy. So they're looking at the politicians being hypocritical, that they're not supporting their own countries and they're going to other developed countries. Ordinary people who were patriotic may view this cartoon as an insult to their government and therefore could be malicious and biased. So is any other relevant answer there? So you're looking at the message. What was the message that the cartoonist wanted to convey? And then the next question is, what can you conclude about Kerry's intention to leave America for Canada? So in other words, what can you say about that act of leaving America for Canada? Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Now again, let's look at the possible response there. He wanted to create an impression that he disagreed with the manner in which the capitalists did business in America. So in other words, that was his way of showing his disagreement with the capitalists in the United States. His action is questionable as he is leaving for another more economically developed country. As I said to you, he's leaving the United States, going to Canada. It's really, there's no difference between those two because they are both developed countries. So it really doesn't change anything, the fact that he's leaving the country. But it still shows his disagreement with the American capitalist. John Kerry is, in fact, one of the richest paid politicians in America and benefited greatly from globalization. That comes from your own knowledge, because remember, it is not in the source. The cartoon does not give you that information, which means that even if you don't know that fact, it doesn't matter, because you will have given the other responses. Okay, don't stress, because you only need 1 point there. Emissions from the 3 ships, as seen in the cartoon, are polluting the environment. Now remember, when we were looking at the other source, the written source, we did look at the fact that these multinational corporations are responsible for pollution. So you could see that in the source. And Kerry is a politician who campaigned for clean air, the Clean Air Act in the United States. So in any other relevant answer there. So that is how you look at that cartoon. Now the next question is asking you to compare sources 1A and 1B. So that is the written source that we read before the break, and then the cartoon that we've just analyzed now, and we looked at the questions. Explain how the information in source B, okay, that is the cartoon, confirms, okay, I'm going to underline that. So in other words, the examiner is already telling you that these sources, A and B, one written, the other one a cartoon, work hand in hand. They work together. But then it's up to you to point out those similarities. Explain how the information in source 1B confirms what is being referred to in source A regarding economic practices in a globalized world. So in other words, show how these sources agree, how they are similar, the written source and the visual source. Now let's look at the likely response there. Okay. Both sources refer to the globalization of the economy. That's the first thing. That is the obvious thing. They are both about the globalization of the economy. Both sources refer to the setting up of the multinational corporations and the transnational corporations in developing countries. Both sources refer to the creation of employment opportunities in developing countries. Both sources refer to the pollution of the environment by the multinational corporations and the transnational corporations. Both sources refer to the wealth that is generated by these MNCs and TNCs that would not benefit local communities, and any other relevant answer. If you look at this possible response or these possible responses, they are looking at both the positives and the negatives, because both those sources were looking at those, how the rich are going to benefit and how the poor are going to be exploited, and in some cases how the poor countries are going to benefit from globalization. So when you're asked to compare the sources, please make sure that you look for the similarities between the two. And then when you're asked to contrast the sources, that means they are totally different and you need to take out or extract the differences. I hope that has helped you understand the different types of sources that you can analyze. So we're going to take another quick commercial break, and when we come back, we are going to analyze an essay question. I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. Now remember, before the break, we looked at the different types of sources based on globalization. And the theme we're doing is the end of the Cold War and a new world order. So the two sources were on the new world order. Now let's look at the essay question on the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is part of the end of the Cold War. So we're going to look at how you can analyze this question and the likely response you are expected to give. Now, if you look at this essay, it's got a statement. It says the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 had a significant impact on South Africa's political future. Okay, I'm quickly going to underline the relevant points here. Okay, so you need to look at the fall of the Soviet Union, and it tells you that it was in 1989, but then you are looking at the impact this fall of the Soviet Union had on South Africa's political future. This is very, very important because it tells you that you're only looking at the political future and not the other things. So that is the statement you're given. And the question is, explain to what extent this statement is valid. So again, I'm going to underline using a different color, to what extent. That is very, very important. Explain to what extent this statement is valid. You need to support your answer by using relevant examples. Now, if you look at this essay question, you are not using the sources anymore. You are using your own knowledge. So where they ask you to support your answer by using relevant examples, they mean relevant examples from your own knowledge, because you should have studied this theme. So you need factual evidence to support your argument. That is very important. Please don't make a mistake of using the sources in an essay like this, because then that will not be relevant. Because remember, the sources we looked at were on globalization and not on the impact of the end or of the collapse of the Soviet Union on South Africa. And then, before we look at the likely response, what I'd like to remind you is what you expected to do in an essay. Now remember, you give an introduction where you state your position. The introduction is there to give scope and direction your argument is going to take. Now remember, the question is to what extent. Explain to what extent the statement is valid. Now, when a marker is reading your introduction, they need to see the extent. You need to state the extent without obviously using the personal pronouns. Was it to a large extent? Was it to some extent? Was it to a small extent? Because then that shows how the rest of your essay is going to be structured, whether you are going to agree with the statement to a large extent or not. It's very, very important to give direction in your introduction. And then you move on to giving the different points in the body of your essay. Now remember, the body of the essay is divided into different paragraphs. One idea, one paragraph. And then in each and every paragraph, that is where you give those specific or relevant examples to support your argument. And you're not just giving those examples, but you're also showing how those examples are answering the question. Okay, provided you've given that direction or you've stated your standpoint in the introduction. And then the last thing you're expected to do in an essay is the conclusion. Now the conclusion ties up the main points. Please don't include information that is not in the body of your essay. You cannot include new ideas in the conclusion, because the conclusion is like a summary of what you've already discussed. That is very important. Now let's look at how this is likely to be marked. So in other words, they're looking at the different points you expected to give. Again, I'm not going to read everything here. Okay, I'm just going to give an overview. Candidates should explain to what extent the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 influenced change in South Africa. Remember, I told you that when I read your introduction, I need to see the extent. So you are supposed to explain to what extent in your introduction. Then you should argue with examples whether the collapse was the only factor that paved the way for negotiations between the National Party and the African National Congress or not. Okay, so in other words, because the question is to what extent. Okay, so your argument should be that to some extent it was the collapse of the Soviet Union that paved the way for the political changes in South Africa, but there were other things that led to the political changes in the country. It wasn't just the collapse of the Soviet Union. Okay, and then it says that you need to take a line of argument and support the response with historical evidence. That is what I was saying before, that factual evidence is very important. And then the main points that should be included in your essay, the introduction should state to what extent. I've already mentioned that I need to see the extent when I look at your introduction, and you need to support your line of argument with relevant examples. And then the body of your essay, this is where you now elaborate. Okay, so you look at the external factors, the fall of the Berlin Wall. You look at the fact that South Africa could no longer use the threat of communism to gain support. It could no longer rely on Western support for its anti-communist stance. The National Party's fear of a communist-controlled ANC also disappeared because the Soviet Union had collapsed. You already know that. The National Party was now prepared to negotiate with the ANC. The collapse of the Soviet Union also affected the ANC. Okay, you also need to state how that happened, how the ANC was affected by the collapse. After the demise of communism, the Soviet Union was no longer prepared to support the ANC. This forced the ANC to negotiate with the National Party because they were obviously no longer getting the aid from the Soviet Union. Influential South Africans began to believe that talks with the ANC were necessary in order to end the turmoil in South Africa, because you know that there was a lot of violence in the country. And then after the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola, the ANC could no longer operate from there. So in other words, the external help that the ANC was getting disappeared as well. So the argument here is that the collapse of the Soviet Union affected or had an impact on both the National Party and the ANC. It's very important to point that out, that it wasn't just the National Party or just the ANC that was affected, but both were affected, and they were both pushed to then move forward and negotiate for a democratic South Africa. And then if we read on, the ANC had to redefine its position and began to seek recognition from Western countries. So again, if you know from your own knowledge, you will look at the fact that the ANC abandoned its socialist policies and they adopted a free market economic policy. Granting of independence to Namibia also encouraged both the National Party and the ANC to pursue peaceful negotiations. So that is how the collapse of the Soviet Union had an influence on South Africa. The National Party saw that majority rule did not mean the introduction of communism, because the ANC was no longer about communism or socialism. The collapse of communism was a critical factor that led to change in South Africa. And that is evident in de Klerk's speech of the 2nd of February 1990, which brought an end to apartheid, and then they obviously accept any other relevant response. Remember, provided that it is relevant. So that is how you elaborate in the body of your essay. And once you've done that, you now conclude by stating your main points. So again, I'm going to underline that the conclusion should tie up the argument. Remember what I said to you before, that please don't give new information that has not been discussed in the body of your essay. With a relevant conclusion with regard to how the collapse of the Soviet Union led to change in South Africa, or how external and internal pressure led to this change. And then in terms of the internal factors, you will look at what was happening in the 1980s. I'm not going to read everything. The fact that there was violence in South Africa, that South Africa was isolated, and the fact that most neighboring states had gained independence. By the end of 1989, the Soviet Union was disintegrated or disintegrating, and the Berlin Wall had fallen, which means that communism was no longer a serious threat. Changes in the world contributed to the end of apartheid. The collapse of the USSR deprived the ANC of its main source of support. We've already looked at that. The National Party's claim to be protecting South Africans from a communist onslaught became unrealistic because communism was no longer a threat. Western world powers supported the move that South Africa resolve its problems peacefully and democratically. So those countries that had supported South Africa before the collapse of the Soviet Union now put pressure on the National Party government to start negotiating with the ANC and other liberation parties. The government started to believe that reform is needed to include the development of a strong black middle class which would act as a bulwark against revolution. The P.W. Botha total strategy did not work, so you will know that from having looked at the 1980s. P.W. Botha suffered a stroke and was succeeded by F.W. de Klerk. This is where you now look at the role of the individual, that the fact that F.W. de Klerk was elected the new president of the country meant that changes were happening in the country because he was a reformist. He was different from the previous leader, P.W. Botha. So it's also very important in your argument to look at the role of the individual. F.W. de Klerk started to accept that the black struggle against apartheid was not a conspiracy directed from Moscow. So in other words, it's that influence of communism was no longer there. And that is why he then engaged in discussions with the Liberation Organization. And then on the 2nd of February 1990, he announced a new and just constitutional dispensation. So by doing that, he was declaring an end to apartheid and any other relevant response. Then, in the conclusion, as before, you tie up your argument with a relevant conclusion. So in other words, in this essay, you expected to look at the external factors that contributed to the change in South Africa's political landscape, and then look at the internal factors as well. And that will bring a balanced argument. I hope that has helped you understand essay writing and how you're supposed to analyze questions. And I wish you all the best. Until next time, goodbye.